And we thank Ned for coming down here. Ned came all the way from South Carolina. Not really. He spends his summers in Bozeman. But we're really glad to have him. He's a good friend for coming up. And he's a philosopher at the College of Charleston in South Carolina. And he's taught there since 1986. He has a PhD from Colorado in Boulder, University of Colorado. He's published dozens of papers. And some of the topics that he's published on are the value of predation, disequilibrium, ecology, and wildness values, exotic species, environmental disobedience, and on a positive role for humans in nature. Most recently, Ned, this is his most recent work here on aesthetics and its relation to environmental protection. Ned lives on an island. He lives in these two great places, Bozeman and on Sullivan's Island, a barrier island outside of Charleston, with his wife Bev Diamond, who is a math professor at the College of Charleston, and his 7-year-old son, Christopher. And he spends the summer in Bozeman, and we're going to try to get him out for some mountain bike riding tomorrow, which he also loves to do. Okay. Ned? And you have water?
I do.
Yes, great.
Thank you all very much for coming out tonight. Despite the heat, I'm really pleased to be here in Missoula. As Dane mentioned, I've been coming to Bozeman in the summers for 10 years or so and have never really had a chance to spend time in Missoula. And I've really enjoyed the little bit I've been here, and I'll be here the rest of the week. And so I'm happy to see this great university town and learn more about it. I'm also in town to buy a mountain bike, so it's exciting for me too. I want to thank Eureka Sato for giving me the impetus to come over here, and then Dane Scott for inviting me to give a talk. As Dane mentioned, my main area of philosophical work has been in environmental ethics, environmental studies to some extent too. A few years back, I became convinced that natural beauty was a really important part of environmental ethics and protecting the environment. So I spent some time reading environmental aesthetic literature. I came to realize that people in environmental ethics really didn't pay much attention to environmental aesthetics, and so the project that I've been engaged in for a while is trying to bring environmental aesthetics back to environmental ethics. Although as I've been studying more and more environmental aesthetics, I've kind of got into it for its own sake because it's such a neat and explosive and exciting field. Anyway, this talk tonight is part of that main project of trying to use natural beauty, environmental aesthetics, and the insights of aestheticians about nature to help protect the environment. So I'm hoping I'll talk about 50 minutes. It might be a touch over. I'll try to limit it. And then we should have lots of times for questions, and I would appreciate them very much, or questions along the way too, if they seem appropriate to you. Okay, so the title of my talk is Objectivity in Environmental Aesthetics and Protection of the Environment. So what I'm worried about in this talk is that natural beauty's subjectivity and relativity make it unsuitable for justifying environmental protection. Contrast John Muir's description of a sunset with his contemporary Oscar Wilde's. Muir says, as in typical Muir fashion, the sunset was glorious. To the east, the water was a rose lavender, the sky a horizon blue, 8 or 10 degrees above a red purple. In the west, gold and purple on the horizon, on the horizontal bars of clouds, shading off into lilac, islands dark purple. So there's Muir. And here's Oscar Wilde's comment about sunsets. Nobody of any real culture ever talks nowadays about the beauty of a sunset. Sunsets are quite old-fashioned. They belong to the time when Turner was the last note in art. To admire them is a distinct sign of provincialism of temperament. Upon the other hand, they go on. Yesterday evening, Mrs. Arundel insisted on my going to the window and looking at the glorious sky, as she called it. Of course, I had to look. And what was it? It was simply a very second-rate Turner, an exaggerated, a Turner of a bad period with all the painter's worst faults exaggerated and overemphasized. Okay, so there you have relativity in environmental aesthetics, put pretty forcefully. So what's my response going to be? along with pluralism of acceptable judgments about natural beauty. So I want to accept some pluralism, some relativity, come constraints that specify better and worse aesthetic responses to nature. Those constraints, I think, and hope provide sufficient objectivity so that the aesthetics of nature can play an important role in environmental protection. And I dub that using aesthetics of nature for environmental protection. I call that aesthetic protectionism. Okay, I think the beauty environment definitely motivates environmental protection. This is a picture of a place along the South Carolina coast called the Grove. We like the stuff on the left, not on the right. We find this sort of thing spectacular and moving. And this is Eklutna Lake in sort of southern Alaska. And we find this stuff appalling and aesthetically negative. We like these sorts of scenes. We don't like these sorts of scenes. Environmental beauty matters to people, I think, a lot. The magnificence of live oaks, South Carolina coast again, monster trees of that sort with Spanish moss and resurrection fern that resurrects itself after a rainstorm and gets from sort of dark brown and gray to beautiful green. That sort of beauty versus the vulgarity of Spall. That's also in South Carolina. It matters. This stuff matters to people a lot. So, one of the ongoing sort of classic debates in environmental policy is whether to drill for oil in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And although there are lots of issues about that, about how much oil is there, can we do it without hurting the porcupine caribou herd or these musk oxen, I think the issue is significantly aesthetic as well. Do we buy Gail Norton's view of it as a godforsaken, mosquito-infested swamp shrouded in frozen darkness half the year? Or do we take Jimmy Carter's view? It's a place of solitude, unmatched beauty, and grandeur. Okay. So aesthetic protectionism is the view not only that, in fact, protecting the environment motivates environmental beauty, motivates people to protect the environment, but it's the view that we can also justify environmental protection using natural beauty and beauty of the environment. That's a hot spring in Yellowstone. Now, there are a number of worries about aesthetic protectionism. That natural beauty it's just too weak and trivial a kind of value compared to the utilitarian values that either lead us to protect the environment, such as health and recreation, or the utilitarian values that lead us to exploit the environment, such as jobs and growth. The idea is that natural beauty is just not anywhere on the same scale. It's much less weak. Here's an environmental philosopher, Gary Varner, who essentially argues that natural beauty can only come in as a tiebreaker, right? If you're going to lose a bunch of jobs and put people out of work, you can't argue that you should do that for the sake of natural beauty. Natural beauty is just too flimsy a value. It only is a tiebreaker. Another worry about aesthetic protectionism is that when we decide how we treat humans, we don't, worry so much about their beauty, right? So the example that one philosopher uses is if a doctor can't decide who to give a heart to based on the attractiveness of the two people, then why should we be able to use aesthetics in this other sort of policy arena, protecting the environment, right? Putting 1,000 people out of jobs for the sake of beauty when we don't use it in human affairs. In fact, it's trivial in human affairs. And I think Loftus suggests in this paper that it's trivial in environmental affairs. Another reason to be worried about using natural beauty to protect the environment is that many people think aesthetic value is just pleasure. It's just sort of aesthetic value reduces to you getting your aesthetic happiness or pleasure. And so it's anthropocentric, it's centered on humans, and it's instrumental. It's using nature for your benefit, whereas the best defenses of nature, many environmental philosophers think, have to be intrinsic, defending nature for its own sake. And the view is that aesthetic value does not involve that. I actually disagree with all these three, but all three of these views, but I'm not going to talk about any of them tonight other than what I just said. The one I want to focus on is that environmental aesthetics is too subjective to help with environmental protection. So one of the first articles in the environmental ethics literature that took seriously natural beauty is this one by Jenna Thompson. She argues, or says in this paper, if aesthetic value judgments are merely personal and subjective, there'll be no way to argue that everyone ought to learn to appreciate or regard natural beauty as worthy of preservation. So consider an environmental aesthetic which claims that great aesthetic value is lost when you take a tranquil and tree-lined road punctuated by farmhouses and small fields and ponds, which is so symbolic of our human harmony with nature, and then you replace it with aggressive strip highway sprawl, auto dealers, gas stations, parking lots, which is symbolic of our society's careless exploitation of the natural world, right? So call that an environmental aesthetic. Then there might be a development aesthetic, according to which great aesthetic value is gained when you replace monotonous and boring weed-infested dirt roads with useful and well-built stores that express hard work, and they reward hard work and determination, and are a sign of entrepreneurial ingenuity, like Walmart is. Right, so you have these contrary aesthetics, and if beauty is in the eye of the beholder, how can aesthetics help us adjudicate between developers who like strip malls and environmentalists who don't? Unless you have some objectivity, aesthetic responses to the environment are a poor basis for environmental protection. Okay, so maybe that point should be clear. Now, the strongest, the most well-known, and I suppose the most well-developed account of objectivity in environmental aesthetics is developed by Alan Carlson. He argues for objectivity in environmental aesthetics as follows. He says aesthetic appreciation of nature must respond to what nature is and not to what it is not. That seems to make sense. And because science tells us what nature is, aesthetic appreciation of nature has got to be informed by science, or more broadly, natural history. And just as aesthetic response to art has to be informed by art history, so aesthetic response to nature has to be informed by natural history. And since science is objective, then an environmental aesthetic that's based on or informed by science will also be objective. Okay, so that's an important view out there, defending the objectivity of environmental aesthetics. I characterize his view as a kind of monism, meaning he's got sort of one take on this. He often puts his point this way. He talks about the appropriate or the correct or true aesthetic appreciation of nature as needing to be guided by science. An aesthetic response to nature that's uninformed by science or natural history then is incorrect or false even, inappropriate. I want to resist his scientific monism, although I actually think Carlson's a great philosopher, and I really like a lot of his views. I think it's problematic in a way I'll try to spell out. I don't think it's plausible that that for nature appreciation to be acceptable, it has to be guided by science rather than other sorts of cognitive or emotional or imaginative type responses. I think there are these other mechanisms to help guide your response to nature, not just science. Nor do I think it's really helpful to use language suggesting, sort of limiting your assessment to aesthetic responses to nature to things like correct or incorrect, true or false, appropriate, inappropriate. I mean, I do think sometimes those are the right judgments, but I think to limit it to those is way too limiting. a scientifically uninformed aesthetic response needn't be unacceptable. So this is a picture of the Columbia Glacier, just outside of the port of Valdez in Alaska. A child or an uneducated adult may not know that a glacier is a river of ice, but there's nothing incorrect or false or even inappropriate about them being wowed by the sight of a calving glacier, even they don't know what it is, right? It's not inappropriate. It's not false. I do think often informed responses are better responses. Knowledge about the nature of glaciers can deepen your response to them. So you might begin to listen and hear the groaning of the ice as it scrapes down the valley once you know what this thing is. And you might have missed that before you had that knowledge. And hence your aesthetic response is deepened. Your perception is deepened with the knowledge. So what I want to propose is a kind of constrained pluralism. There are lots of, there's a plurality of better and worse aesthetic responses to environment. And we also should understand better and worse in a lot of different ways, not just appropriate, inappropriate, but a whole series of different ways, not just in those ways. I think this is the most plausible type of objectivity. It's the kind that I'm trying to sort of stipulate. And I think it provides, I'm hoping it provides enough objectivity to make aesthetic protectionism possible or viable, as I put it here. Now, in some ways, I'm not sure that this view is any different than a lot of other views out there. But it falls between two extremes. Naive monism, there are uniquely correct and appropriate responses to the environment, science-based approach being one example of that. And then on the other side, anything goes subjectivism. You can have any sort of aesthetic response, make any sort of aesthetic judgment about nature, and it's as good as any other. So I want to be in between that, which seems like the right place to be. And virtually everybody is there. They distinguish between better and worse responses. And it's true of people who have very different approaches to aesthetics. So obviously Carlson wants to make distinctions between better and worse aesthetic responses. But so does Noel Carroll, and his is a very different position on appreciating nature. It's not science-based, but he calls it his arousal theory, being emotionally aroused by nature. And he wants to have better and worse emotional arousals. And also Emily Brady, who is a strong critic of Carlson's and wants to base her environmental aesthetic not on science but on imagination, she too works like the Dickens to get better and worse aesthetic responses, to avoid this anything-goes subjectivism. A really good source, I think, in this is Ronald Hepburn's paper that I have put up on the screen here. I think I've stolen a lot of his concepts in the next few slides. Okay, so what are some of the different kinds of better and worse aesthetic responses to nature? Deep would be better, superficial, shallow, worse. So hiking in the Lewis and Clark Caverns, not too far from here, a couple summers ago, the guide kept pointing out Disney characters in the caverns, and I think that response is superficial, irrelevant, distracting. That was, so there's an example of superficial response, a shallow response, again contrasted with deep. I think of the scenery cult as a kind of shallow type of nature appreciation. There's a very well-developed literature out there criticizing the inability of many people to appreciate unscenic nature as a kind of aesthetic vice. So for the scenery cult, the idea is that you appreciate and can only appreciate the dramatic landscapes of nature, the grand scenery. So when you go to a national park, what you do is you drive through the park, you stop at scenic viewpoints for snapshots, and then get your picture postcards at the local gift shop. And that's what appreciating a national park is all about. I think of this as a lazy kind of appreciation, interested only in easy beauty, the beauty that comes to you easily. You don't want to have to do any work for the beauty. Appreciation of just beauty when it comes in the picturesque form. rather than a kind of deeper and more multi-sensuous engagement. So there's an example of shallow nature appreciation, and there's a lot of good work out there. Yuriko Saito has a wonderful paper on the aesthetics of unscenic nature where she thinks about this concept in a very helpful way, I think. Oops, did I want to do that? No. Another distinction here is between multi-sensuous perception using lots of different senses versus just vision as a way of appreciating nature. And related to that, perhaps a kind of lively, active aesthetic response versus a more feeble and lazy and passive response. So contrast appreciating a lake by sitting on the shore and looking at it versus jumping in and feeling the water. Right? Much more active and more senses. Or this is an example that Professor Saito gives too. Imagine watching a storm from your window inside versus going out and walking around in it. Right? Those are better sorts of responses. Discriminating, undiscriminating responses, attentive responses, unattentive responses, mature versus immature responses. Some responses are relatively unbiased, others are biased. Example of that might be a kind of self-indulgent response where you're just kind of thinking about yourself. And patient versus hasty, perceptive versus confused. Thoughtful responses, reflective responses would be better than unthinking responses. So you just use a stereotype, right? And you appreciate nature through a common stereotype. That would be an example of unthinking response. Knowledgeable versus ignorant and distorted response. An example of that might be think about people who, when they appreciate wolves, they only think of a kind of romanticized view of wolves as cute and cuddly as they are in this picture, and ignore that they're predators and that they kill for a living, right? And so an aesthetic response that distorts the truth about what you're appreciating or suppresses important truths would be a worse response. That's language I think I'm getting from Hepburn. John Donne on Mountains, I think, is a response based on a kind of ignorance, or I don't know quite what to say, but right, so we heard about this from Yuriko in class today, but right, God originally made the world a smooth sphere, and then he warped it because of human sins. So there's Devil's Tower. What is it? According to John Donne, it's warts. These mountains are warts and pockholes in the face of the earth, right? And insofar as that aesthetic judgment is based on what most of us think is a fairy tale, then it's worse than one that doesn't distort and based on ignorance. Now, this is controversial, and we certainly should talk about this. But anyway, that's OK, so there's my attempt to say a little bit about the different kinds of better and worse aesthetic responses. Now, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about doubts about the objectivity of environmental appreciation. The main one is that nature appreciation lacks the kind of objectivity or the objectivity that art appreciation has, that art is much more objective than nature. This is initially quite plausible and I think pretty popular idea in the philosophy of art. It's held by, among others, Malcolm Budd, John Fisher, and Kendall Walton. I have serious doubts about this claim, or maybe I should say, well, I do have serious doubts, but I want it to be false. I don't want art appreciation to be more objective than nature appreciation. I'm not sure it is, but these guys think it is. Here's John Fisher, his account of relativism in environmental aesthetics. He says, at a great mountain, Mount Fuji or the Grand Teton, this is the Grand Teton, would strike many of us as noble and strong, but it's perfectly conceivable that it might strike an observer from an alien culture as comical or agonized. In the case of a natural object like a mountain, such relativity is no real problem because the mountain isn't really noble or comical. We can only say that there are different ways to regard the mountain. There's no real fact of the matter here. Okay, that's what he thinks about environmental aesthetics. And on art objectivity, he says this: it's harder to swallow that kind of relativism when it comes to the expressive properties of art. He says, what I'm suggesting is that emotional qualities that artworks express are not dispensable facts about them, although the emotional qualities are dispensable facts about natural objects. So Edvard Munch's The Scream is, he says, truly frightening. The fact that the scream might strike a viewer from another culture as cheerful should not make us think that the scream is a cheerful painting. Okay, so they're facts of the matter about appropriate emotive responses to art, but not about nature. The typical argument for the greater objectivity of art vis-a-vis nature is that the constraints on art appreciation that are provided by artistic design and social convention are absent with nature appreciation. Natural beauty lacks an artist whose design and intention puts limits on how you should appropriately appreciate it. So when someone looks at a Cubist painting and judge it in terms of representational accuracy, they're making a big mistake, because the people who developed those paintings weren't trying to be accurate representationally. In contrast, nature doesn't intend you to appreciate it one way or the other. And also, there are no social conventions for the appreciation of nature as there are for art appreciation. You should ignore the coughing during a concert, but you can choose whether or not you want to integrate the sound of a distant train into your environmental appreciation. In literature, the words have conventional meaning, right? There is a meaning there, but if whatever meaning nature has is not some conventional thing, but it's something that we create. There aren't really nature critics. John Fisher argues like this, as there are art critics. Okay, so here Fisher talks about the sounds of nature and the fact that we can frame them pretty much like we want. So the person who listens to nature, he says, is free of the criteria that govern the appreciation of music and that rule out lots of ways to appreciate them. So if you're appreciating nature, he says you're sitting in a hot tub, do you want to listen to the warblers or the wind in the palm trees, or do you add the buzzing of the ventilators, right? Do you integrate the cricket, right? Or do you separate them? It's your choice. It's not like there's a certain way you have to do it like there is when you listen to music, right? Do you add in the honking of the horn or not? That's your choice, he says. He says nature does not dictate an intrinsically correct way to frame its sounds in the way that a composer does. And thus there are a large multiplicity of structures and relations that we might hear, and all of them seem equally legitimate. Okay. Budd takes the point that Fisher just made about sounds of nature and generalizes it to all of the appreciation of nature. It's endowed with a freedom denied to artistic appreciation. And they both argue, I think, that there is this relativity in framing. Pretty much, I think they believe there's full framing freedom when you're appreciating nature. So unlike art, or where the artist or the category of art frames the objects to you, for you, it's up to us how we frame the nature experience, right? So you look at a painting and you don't look at the backside, or you don't knock on it to see how it sounds, but you could look at the backside of a tree or knock on the tree to appreciate the tree, right? We do the framing here with nature. Budd argues that there's no proper level of observation for nature. You can look at nature through a telescope or a microscope or with your unaided eye. There's no optimum conditions for nature observation. Look at it whether it's foggy or clear, bright or dark, near or far. Right? Well, you can't do that with painting, right? You can't do that when you're listening to a symphony. You can't, right? And you can use any sense modality with nature, he argues. In general, we're free to frame nature and appreciate natural objects as we please. So he argues for full framing freedom. I, again, have my doubts. I think he overstates the amount of freedom involved. I think there are constraints on framing nature appreciation. Once you've settled on a particular natural object as the object of aesthetic attention, many framing choices have been ruled out. So you shouldn't appreciate, for example, a trout in a mountain stream with a telescope or with a microscope. So there are better and worse levels of observation in particular cases. You don't want to appreciate a cliff from an airplane, 6 miles high, or in a Winnebago on a dark night, right? So there are better and worse conditions of observation given that you're trying to appreciate the cliff. Are we really free to use any sense modality in appreciating a mountain? It's not clear. I do think framing pluralism exists. I do think that there is greater framing freedom in nature than in art. I do think there's some truth to the point they're making, but I don't think it's full framing freedom, and I also don't think that the pluralism that you get with choosing what to appreciate in nature is necessarily a problem for using aesthetic appreciation to protect nature. So whether you focus on one loon or 40 or listen to the wind in the trees along with the warblers, that seems irrelevant to the possibility of using environmental beauty for environmental protection. Whether you look at a mountain through the fog and the early morning light during the middle of an afternoon on a perfectly clear day, or focus on the smell of the spruce trees in the mountain after rain, or the taste of its wild huckleberries, that doesn't seem to threaten using the appreciation of nature to protect it. And the reason it doesn't threaten it is because all of these ways are positive, right? They're all aesthetically positive responses. So when the pluralism involves a multiplicity of positive responses, it's not clear to me it threatens using natural beauty for environmental protection. And also when these responses are of greater aesthetic value than the aesthetic responses to degraded environments, then again, the pluralism in environmental aesthetics isn't necessarily going to hurt the case for using natural beauty to protect the environment, because the pluralism is all of greater aesthetic value than, as I'm stipulating here, than the aesthetic response to degraded environments. I do think some pluralism in environmental aesthetics creates problem for aesthetic protectionism. And the case I want to develop at some length here is whether or not to include human intrusions in your environmental appreciative judgments. So should we have snowmobiles in Yellowstone? Big, hot, ongoing issue. Is it an appropriate and compatible winter use? So here are the gatekeepers at West Yellowstone putting on gas masks. The air right around the gate is as bad as in Los Angeles in the winter. Here are the snowmobiles alongside the buffalo. Here's the skier who has to listen to these sounds in the distance. Should we put a racetrack next to a world-class cypress swamp nature preserve? So this has been a huge issue in Charleston, where I spend most of my time. They want to put a racetrack right next to the Beidler Forest, and we've been fighting that for a long time. Another controversial issue that's been going on for decades is airplanes and helicopter flights over. Here's the Grand Canyon, airplane flights over there. Here, helicopter flights in Denali National Park in Alaska. So you're not allowed to drive your car into Denali. There are only very few cars. You go off hiking, and these people are heli hiking. They get flown in, and or another one of my concerns, and this doesn't have to do with sound, but homes on the top of ridges, ridges that used to be treed, and now they're big houses, and it's sprouting all over Montana. Bozeman has them like crazy now. Okay, so I'm suggesting these are human intrusions into nature. And again, we can do this environmental versus anti-environmental framing. The environmentalists think of engine noise as degrading the natural tranquility. But if we think of framing choices as arbitrary, then the anti-environmentalists can argue that such sounds can be framed out of the experience. Just frame them out, ignore them. The Yellowstone skier can be asked to frame out the stench and whine of the snowmobiles. The developer can ask those on the Beidler Forest night owl walks to ignore the sounds of the nearby Friday night races. Hikers in the national parks can just ignore the aircraft noise. The developer can ask those hiking the forest to ignore the trophy homes on the ridge tops. And if there are no better and worse aesthetic ways of framing these aesthetic experiences, why shouldn't they be asked to frame these things out? Okay, so now I want to argue that an overall aesthetic assessment of these environments should include these sounds, smells, and sights. It's fitting and natural to include and even to focus on these central properties. To ignore them would be like standing in the Snake River Valley of Wyoming and refusing to look up to the west, right, where the Tetons rise up. That's not a serious attempt to appreciate the Grand Teton National Park. Aesthetic judgments about environments that frame out human intrusion similarly distort those aesthetic responses. You know, if somebody insists on putting a skyscraper in the Snake River Valley and saying it won't detract from the aesthetic beauty of the valley because you can frame it out, has a mistaken view of how free framing choices in environmental appreciation can legitimately be. It's kind of like you're in a symphony and your companion says, don't worry about that horrible smell or the machine gun fire outside, just listen to the music. So I think some framing decisions are more natural, they're more fitting and appropriate given certain circumstances. Noel Carroll, one of the people working in this field, claims that there are certain sort of natural frames, so certain natural expanses have natural frames or natural closures, so it gives examples of caves and grottos and clearings and valleys, and other natural expanses, though lacking frames, he says, have features that are naturally salient for human organisms, moving water, brilliant illumination, stuff like that. And they instinctually draw our attention to them. So there are sort of natural ways of framing things, according to Carroll, and I think that fits with the way I'm arguing about how we should respond to these intrusions. Consider the scale dependence of aesthetic response. So Hepburn points out that the mountain that we appreciate for its majesty and stability is on a different time scale, as fluid as the ripples on the lake at its foot. But that shouldn't make us think that the aesthetic qualities we enjoy in the mountain, its stability, its firmness, are not appropriately appreciable. Clear cuts are paradigms, I think, of environmental aesthetic disvalue, but if you scale up, they're temporary blips in this ongoing and aesthetically exciting process of forest recovery. But this shouldn't lead us to agree with a forest industry executive that they're not ugly because we should adopt the 200-year scale. Aesthetic qualities can be made to vanish and aesthetic judgments can be undermined by taking a different perspective, but that doesn't show that from a particular perspective any aesthetic response is as good as any other, nor that we should accept the idea that any perspective is as appropriate as any other. Some framing, I think, of environmental appreciation is awkward and forced and myopic, given the kind of beings we are, the scales on which we operate, the legitimate purposes of aesthetic appreciation. Some ways of framing environmental appreciation are not acceptable, including the anti-environmentalist demand to frame out human intrusions or to appreciate nature from irrelevant or distorted scales. I do think there are some relativity in aesthetic value judgments. This is an example of John Fisher. One person finds the cuckoo sounds of doves to be extremely harmonious and to express a kind of soothing calm. A friend may find the same sounds to be obtrusive. There's a kind of relativity, and not just a pluralism, but a relativity with conflict. It's hard to think of how can they be both. Maybe the Grand Tetons could appear puny to someone who grew up in the Himalayas, or to comical to somebody thinking of the meaning of the French word Teton. Right? So maybe they're not majestic if this is the perspective you're coming from. The sound of an approaching snowmobile may be soothing rather than obnoxious if you're lying there hypothermic waiting for help, or if you're a snowmobile rental business owner and you're worried about where your money's going to come from. You know, if you hunt the deer in the new growth after a clear cut, or the logger who cut the trees, maybe that's not an eyesore for you. I'm going to take some of this back in a minute, but okay, so there was a unit on doubts about objectivity in environmental aesthetic, and now the last part of the talk is what I call sort of resources to help with objectivity in environmental aesthetics, constraints on aesthetic appreciation of nature, and there are really three that I want to talk about: cognitive factors, objectivity and emotional responses to nature, and disinterestedness of aesthetic response. So cognitive factors. Cognitive has to do with knowledge and understanding and information as constraints on environmental aesthetic responses. So I think sometimes there are correct and incorrect categories with which to appreciate natural objects, and they can help distinguish appropriate from inappropriate aesthetic responses. So this is an example of Carlson's. Okay, so cute woodchuck or massive, awe-inspiring rat? What's your guess? It's a woodchuck. But anyway, whether it's massive, which is an aesthetic quality, or an awe-inspiring, or whether it's cute, depends on getting it in the right category. Spectacular full moon or obnoxious satellite dish. So again, whether you have it, how you respond to it depends on whether you get it in the right category. Amazing lime green creek or revolting mine runoff. So I took this picture in Yellowstone in a place called Lemonade Creek. So it's, but how you respond to it depends on knowing what it is. At least if you believe that cognitive features should play in your aesthetic response, which is, a lot of people find that highly controversial, but I'm arguing that they should, or claiming that they should anyway. Information about environment can improve our aesthetic response. Right, so knowing that what you've encountered is an ivory-billed woodpecker that was thought to be extinct until recently will enhance your and deepen your aesthetic response. If you lack that information about the environment, that can impoverish your aesthetic response. This is the Washoe Reserve outside of Charleston. Is that place and swamps like it yucky? Well, a negative aesthetic response to swamps based on the stereotyped and ignorant idea that they're bug-infested wastelands, which is just false. They do all kinds of wonderful ecological services, and because the water moves, they really aren't buggy at all. But if your aesthetic response is based on that kind of false belief, then you have an unacceptable aesthetic response because it's affected by these false beliefs. Now, I don't think false beliefs necessarily disqualify an aesthetic response. Carroll has this example. He says, you could be excited by the grandeur of a blue whale. You can be moved by its size, its force, and the amount of water it displaces, but you might think it's a fish. You might not know that it's a mammal. Okay, so you have a false belief, and he says, but that doesn't make your response to the blue whale inappropriate because you have this false belief. I think he's right about that, but I think the response only remains appropriate because the false belief doesn't have a bearing on, doesn't affect your aesthetic response. I think if it affects it, if it has influence on it, then the false belief will make your aesthetic response worse. This is a shot of the Alaska pipeline. I think the judgment about whether this pipeline, the transatlantic pipeline, Alaska pipeline, enhances or detracts from Alaska's beauty needs to be informed by, again, environmental knowledge. In this case, knowledge about the environmental and social impacts of our society's oil addiction. Picture of the Earth at night and the lights. More generally, I think knowledge of environmental problems should inform environmental aesthetic appreciation. In a world where the human dominance over nature was not so extensive, perhaps the sight of an 800-mile-long pipeline through wildlands needn't be appalling. But in today's world, at least those informed and properly appreciative of the massive human impact on the planet, the appropriate response to these types of human intrusions in nature shouldn't be positive. My view, the view I'm pushing here, suggests that we don't have apartheid for aesthetics. You need to reject an aesthetics that sees, that thinks of aesthetics as purely informalistic or other sorts of narrow ideas of the aesthetic. The aesthetic that this argument depends on thinks aesthetics is hooked up with the rest of life, and that means there's no strict separation between aesthetics, ethics, and cognition. Our cognitive approach is best for aesthetic protectionism. A well-known writer in aesthetics argues that they are. There's Marcia Eaton. It's her view. She identifies numerous flawed environmental policies that are based on ecologically ignorant appreciative responses. So she thinks that you need ecological knowledge to inform your aesthetic response, because a lot of our policies that are harmful to the environment are based on aesthetic responses that come out of ecological ignorance. So she argues that the image of deer as Bambi-like and sweet and innocent ignores the ecological truth that they can really cause huge amounts of damage, and makes it real hard for forest managers to convince the public to reduce deer herds, because we have this sweet Bambi image response to deers. Okay, and it's an ecologically uninformed response. So we get better policy if we informed our aesthetic response with ecology. Part of why forest fires have been prevented, or had been prevented for so long, is that people found them ugly, and the result is that many fire-adapted species have had a hard time surviving, and a lot of our forests are tinderboxes because they haven't burned for so long. Here's the green lawn. Eaton argues that as long as people want large, green, closely mowed yards, no matter what the climate or soil or water conditions, they will continue to use polluting gasoline mowers and a toxic cocktail of fertilizers and herbicides and pesticides. So I guess what she's arguing is that they wouldn't find these lawns so attractive once they consider their ecological consequences. Okay? So those are all examples of where information and knowledge should lead to aesthetic responses more in tune with good environmental policy. But I want to point out that these cognitive approaches can be a double-edged sword. They can also lead the wrong way. If you insist that aesthetic response to nature be informed by correct environmental knowledge, that can lead to harmful behavior. So there are popular but fallacious ecological ideas that are environmentally beneficial. So claims about the deep interconnections in nature, nature's delicate balance, are significantly overstated in my judgment. But they're quite useful for environmental protection, right? If you think there's deep interconnection, you won't extinguish a species because you'll believe the whole thing will collapse. If you think nature is such a delicate balance, if that's your response, then you'll, again, keep out, not intrude into it. So I think ensuring that your aesthetic response to nature is informed by scientific facts isn't any guarantee that it'll be conducive to protecting the environment. Okay, so those were the cognitive resources to help with objectivity. The second resource is objectivity and emotional responses to nature. So Noel Carroll and other people argue that you can have objectivity not just in a kind of knowledge-based Carlson-like environmental aesthetic, but also in one based on emotional arousal. So just as it's inappropriate to be amused when a dog is hit by a car, to laugh, to think it's funny, right? Just as it's inappropriate to dance gaily to somber music. Okay, so the point here is there are appropriate emotional responses to certain aesthetic objects. So it's inappropriate to be bored by a thundering waterfall crashing down on your head, or to be soothed by the hum of snowmobiles. So I'm arguing for better and worse emotional responses to the environment. Emotions are underpinned by beliefs and have more or less appropriate objects. Right? You should be afraid of a tank, but not of chicken soup. Okay, that's Carroll's example. For those properly sensitive to the massive harmful human impacts on the planet, the sounds of chainsaws will alarm. Belching smokestacks will disgust, and pollution sunsets will not strike them as appealing. Positive emotional responses to environmental degradation, the glee at the sight of a polluted river and the smell of its dead fish, satisfaction from seeing trophy homes on the top of mountain ridges, manifest ignorance about the human impact on the planet, and a skewed emotional constitution or blinding self-interest. Okay, the third and final resource to help with objectivity in environmental aesthetics is this controversial aesthetic notion of disinterestedness and the role it can play in positive aesthetic responses to environmental degradation. Many argue that aesthetic appreciation requires disinterestedness. What is it? Well, a freeing of the mind from self-interested and instrumental attention towards the aesthetic object. So If you like a play because you're going to make a lot of money from the play, you're not properly disinterested, and that liking of the play is an aesthetic response because it's not disinterested. An aesthetic response is supposed to be disinterested, not self-interested. I think positive responses to environmental degradation, at least the way I want to characterize environmental degradation, are often self-interested and thus not properly aesthetic. So clear cuts may appear attractive to a logger or a forestry executive. Snowmobiles in the wilderness may sound harmonious to the person whose business depends on them or who's lying there hurt and needs to be evacuated. But I think such responses are so infused with self-interest as to be disqualified from disinterested aesthetic response. So you can rule these out. These are not really aesthetic responses because they're so infused with self-interest. The developer's aesthetic that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk may not be an aesthetic at all, if I'm right about this. Conclusions. Oops. Environmental aesthetics should play an important role in environmental protection. I don't think aesthetic relativity and subjectivity cripple that project. I do think there's legitimate pluralism and relativity in responses to natural beauty, but I don't think that prevents us from distinguishing between better and worse aesthetic responses. And I do think there are numerous resources in environmental aesthetics that can help with objectivity and will allow environmental aesthetics to play a useful role in environmental protection. So there's the end. Thank you.
Ned, we'll just let you fill your own questions.
Great.
Maybe for 10 minutes or so.
Sorry, here.
You kind of like the picture.
Which one do you like? I was going to leave that one up there. Here, let me get this. Sorry. Anyway, I very much would, I think I kind of ran through that quickly and bored a lot of you, but I'm working on a paper, I have a paper that this talk came from, and it's got a lot of things to improve, and so help me make it better. Christopher.
If a lack of disinterest disqualifies an aesthetic appreciation, which is what
That's
we
not
saw
aesthetic,
the developer
yeah.
and the logger, et cetera, how can I ever be sure that my well-informed environmental appreciation isn't self-interested? Like, I want that clean water, and I want that lovely cold air, and I want to be out there hiking in these beautiful forests.
Good question. And well, there's a parallel to that problem in environmental ethics. And in environmental ethics, I'm clear about that I think I have a response to that there is a response, that I am environmental aesthetics. So people will argue that, you're a member of the Sierra Club, and you're protecting, you want logging to cease in the local forest, and somebody else wants to log it. And the idea is that environmentalists are just self-interested users of the environment like anybody else. Okay, this is in environmental ethics. And they certainly are. I mean, environmentalists like to go hike, they like to go mountain biking on these places, and they'd rather not worry about stumps and the skiing. And in that regard, maybe there isn't, there are differences in terms of the impact of the environmentalist use of these areas versus the, they're much lighter uses, I think. But they're, in that sense, they're self-interested uses. But a lot of environmentalists, want to protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, whether they go there or not. Right? They want to protect areas for their own sake. Yeah, they want to go skiing there, maybe, but it's different than simply, cutting down the trees to make a living. Right? There is some concern with preserving those areas for their own sake. Okay. So anyway, I'm not sure I said that all that well, but I always thought that in environmental ethics, that's a reasonably good response. I don't know, maybe you don't think that even, but in environmental aesthetics, Yeah, maybe Eureka can help you out.
I mean,
Yeah.
going back to the clean water, it is, can be construed as being interested, and it is an interested motivation. But at the same time, it's not your personal stake. I mean, presumably you want clean water, but so do all of us. Whereas if you're a developer and then developing Walmart or whatever, then although I mean you may have to worry about your workers and so on, but still it's a very sort of personal, self-contained, interest. So that could be one kind of a distinction between. Yeah, both are in a way interested, but the interest in the clean water could be construed as not self-interest, but more, I don't know, a wider interest. I don't know how to put it, but that could be one way of getting around that problem.
Is there almost always an economic issue? Or no? It just seems...
No, I don't. Mountain biking isn't really an economic issue for
Well,
the
no, I mean,
environmental side. But I mean, Christopher's arguing that you find the forest pretty or beautiful or uncut because you know that the stream will be clearer and you'll have better fishing. And that's why you think that the clear cut on the side of the hill is ugly and that the forest on the side of the hill is beautiful, because you have this self-interest in fishing the river or in walking through the forest. Now, I think one thing I might want to say, here is if aesthetic appreciation is a kind of intrinsic value of the object for its beauty, then you've got intrinsic value. You don't have using it for your own benefit. And I do think if that's the way I want to try to cash out aesthetic value. But maybe you're saying, well, the reason you aesthetically value the quiet in the park for its own sake is because you like to ski there. And so you're no different than the snowmobiler who doesn't mind the noise at all because he likes to go there.
You can use the concept of the common good as a value, reason for preserving.
For example, the most important product that the world provides is clean, fresh, potable water, and it's deteriorating extremely fast. And if we don't protect the watersheds, then we're not going to have that. I don't care where in the world you are. And that's if we can't drink the water. And it's telling me that we have technology that will take care of that is a poor substitute for clean water.
So what I would consider that, I mean, the lingo that I use for that is a sort of human-centered reasons for protecting nature, and they may in the end be the strongest. We need clean air, we need clean water, we need a world that has a stable climate. Maybe those are in the end the strongest kinds of arguments, but they depend on science, and the philosophers don't have a lot to say about those arguments, I don't think. And so I want aesthetics to play a role in that debate too, and not to be just shoved aside because what we really care about is clean water.
Well, that's my excuse, though, for protecting the environment, because I do want clean water.
Right, and you think the hillside is uncut is much more attractive, much of higher aesthetic value than the clear-cut hillside because of your concern with clean water.
I'm a forester, and I think clear cuts are appropriate under certain circumstances, and if they're used properly, they can protect the environment. Some trees cannot regenerate to regenerate that logged area unless they have full sunlight and exposed soil. That's Western Orange. So as a forester, I see if it's done well, clear cuts can be, to me, can be beautiful if they're done right. Because if you don't get natural regeneration, you can plant it. And if you don't have you don't have that clear cut in full sunlight and nutrients and soil exposed, you're not going to get a large reproduction.
I don't quite understand the science behind your point, but I think if it's correct, that I think it can fit with the sort of thing I've been arguing, that information, cognitive factors can legitimately affect your aesthetic response. There's a gentleman back there that has his hand up.
Yeah, I've been listening to these questions, and I think they all are related in that they're about, you know, what's the appropriate criteria we should be using to make these aesthetic judgments. It seems, if I understood your lecture right, it sounds like you're offering us two possibilities. One is disinterestedness, and that is potentially useful, but ends up maybe being an issue of trying to do some sort of human calculus where you're trying to figure out the greatest good, or it's trying to figure out who's more disinterested. So potentially you kind of get lost in that. The other thing that it sounds like you've offered us, and I think is more core to what you're presenting, is beauty. But then, you know, as you brought up, the problem with beauty as a criteria is that it does change, and things that seem beautiful to people, like bluegrass and trees, can be, or a golf course, can be tremendously costly, you know, ecologically. And I'm wondering if there, you know, you gave us a number of examples of positive judgments and negative judgments, and I didn't have any trouble agreeing with all of those. But I think my agreement came before beauty or disinterestedness. And I'm wondering if there's another criteria that we're not quite getting to yet for making aesthetic, or for that all of these aesthetic judgments that we make are based in. If we can get to that criteria, maybe we can actually find some common ground.
Well, I mentioned cognitive considerations, sort of knowing that this is polluted mine runoff will affect your aesthetic response, or should. So that's an example of cognitive. I mentioned emotional kinds of responses, better and worse emotional responses. I mentioned the criteria of disinterestedness. Aesthetic response can't be infused with self-interest, or it's not really aesthetic. Then there's sort of formalistic, more purely, narrowly aesthetic criteria for beauty, for positive aesthetic responses too, that I didn't talk a lot about. But there are lots of criteria for what counts as aesthetic value and proper aesthetic appreciation.
I'm just wondering, I'm not doubting the pleasure or dismay that I feel, or that we feel, in response to these images. What my question is what's the source of those feelings? What are those? What ground do our confidence in those experiences come out?
Well, I think I'm not sure I'm really following you, but so I'm going to repeat myself. I think they're clearly perceptual responses that we have. When you're talking about aesthetics, and you're talking about natural beauty and positive aesthetic value in nature, you have some kind of sensual response informed by associations of various sorts, cognitive ones, emotional ones, and then you have to argue, like I was trying to do, about which of those counts for better, or maybe you don't have to argue if you don't want to, if you're a sort of pure relativist about aesthetics, then you don't want to argue about those. But I want to try to rank them, or to make distinctions between better and worse responses on those kinds of grounds. And anyway, okay.
I think there's a corollary to his question, which is how do you get beyond saying that with correct perception or good judgment, you see the things these way? Because how else do you communicate? How else do you use aesthetics and instrumentality in forming judgments and persuading other people?
I think what you guys are talking about is people they disagree about their aesthetic response, and then you're asking, well, what do you do to try to sort through that possibly to reach agreement or to prove that one response is superior to another, right? And that's really what I was working on that the whole talk. Here's a little different line. Somebody doesn't like deserts. They think they're boring and, you know. Well, take them camping in the desert. Spend a week out there with them. Have them read Little Edward Abbey. Take them there when the flowers are exploding in the spring. Give them a desert guide and learn about the animals and plants and how they survive. And my guess is that, I mean, there's no guarantee, but that after you go through that process, it's going to be much harder for someone to think of deserts as just sort of boring and nothing going on there. So there's another kind of response here. Okay, Eureka, and then I'll go there. Yeah.
Okay, just a comment. I sort of struggle with the same issue in my work, and I personally sort of first sort of was gravitating toward Carlson's, and there is certain attraction to his view, but I like the way you sort of got away from the either extreme of anything goes subjectivism and the monism of Carlson's cognitive model. And I think what you did with A Better or Worse is to sort of have all kinds of criteria that you listed, deep and informed and misleading and so on. Those are the criteria to sort of weed out some of the responses which may not be helpful, which may not be well, appropriate. So desert being boring to me, because I don't know much about desert, it's just a bunch of sand. You know, if that's my impression, well, that's where I start. But then you take me camping, and then you teach me all kinds of desert ecology and so on. And I think that, you know, our view, experience and response is bound to change. The reverse side of that is Marsha Eden's example of a golf course and a green lawn, lush green lawn. But you read about what goes into maintaining that, particularly in the sort of, you know, the middle of Arizona or something like that. And I don't have the statistics with me, but I mean, the amount of residential water use in arid area to maintain green lawn is obscene. And then coupled with that with toxic soot. So when you know, have all that education, you look at the green lawn, is it as lush and green belty, smooth, beautiful as before I had that knowledge? I think something changes. Not necessarily making it ugly or negative, but it's not. It gains another layer of complexity.
When you see the green lawn, you don't just see the green lawn, but you think of the dead birds at the same time. Right? So that's part of your response to the green lawn, is an image of dead birds.
When you went through this, I was seeing in opposition natural beauty and humans' technology, and the greater the technological impact on nature, the uglier it was. And I'm wondering, is that correct from your point of view?
I toyed with it, but I should let you finish.
And then what I didn't see, and this is going back maybe partially to the desert, is a comparison between something that is naturally beautiful, environmental beauty, with something that is naturally not beautiful. And should we therefore protect that which is beautiful because it is beautiful, as opposed to something which is not beautiful, but natural? And I guess that goes back to the question about this appreciation. Is all of the deep appreciation, all those things that you put in the column underneath deep appreciation, are those all essentially aesthetic?
Oh, okay. Well, just three little questions. Yeah. No, they're very good questions and really helpful and interesting. I've done some of my thinking over the years has defended wildness value, and wildness I define as the degree to which humans haven't manipulated something or control it. Okay? And I find tremendous value in wildness in all kinds of ways, almost religious, and now I'm starting to think wildness is kind of an aesthetic value. I used to think it was just ethical. I think it's all. And so I value that highly, but it's not the only value. It doesn't always trump. And even in aesthetics, I don't. The problem with you can take a sort of nasty little patch of natural scrubby stuff. There are no exotic species that humans have introduced, but just nature, little scrubby, ugly stuff. And you can turn it into a garden. Beautiful, right? And with technology and knowledge and now the problem there is you're no longer comparing nature against nature. You're comparing nature with a kind of humanized nature, impacted nature. So that's one thing you have to notice. And can it make it more aesthetically valuable overall if we can kind of ignore the fact that it's a lot less natural and that might degrade its aesthetic value in certain dimensions, in certain ways? Yeah, the Sistine Chapel is more aesthetically valuable than my backyard. Yeah. Okay. I don't know. So technology can make, I guess, is that technology? Well, it's our technology, but I guess skyscrapers can be cool looking. And there are other issues there. Anyway, the positive aesthetic question, although maybe you didn't see it this way, you said, well, what about ugly nature, aesthetically negative nature? And there's a view out there in the literature called positive aesthetics, which says all of nature is positive aesthetically. And there are lots of different ways of cashing that out. Some say that only natural kinds are, not every particular, like mountains and not this particular piece of ground or something like that. And others want to say, yeah, and it's all perfectly beautiful and it's all equally beautiful. Okay, so I haven't developed a view on this completely, but I don't think it's all equally beautiful. I think a pileated woodpecker is more magnificent a creature than the little house sparrow or something. Okay, so I think there are degrees of aesthetic value in nature. Nature isn't as beautiful as it could be, so it's not ultimately valuable. The highest. Is there any bits of ugly nature? Well, Eureka has a paper where she kind of gets some nice examples. I think her examples, as I remember, are nature where, well, maybe this is where animals are suffering, or where humans are suffering.
It's Holmes, the elk carcass in is that
right, right. Some nature you say is so annoying and buggy and obnoxious that but see, people don't understand. Swamps are holy places, and they're magnificent. They're magnificent. Just kayak through the swamp. Okay, but no, I think in this paper you actually try to give examples of negative aesthetic pieces of nature. The general line defending positive aesthetics that Carlson has given is and the positive aesthetics again is the idea that all of nature is beautiful, is positive aesthetically. And his argument is, well, if natural beauty involves appreciating nature through science, there's this interesting science going on in the nasty little patch of weeds, as there is in the rainforest or something like that.
But can I just ask?
Sure, please,
you're
jump in.
saying that, and I would probably agree with you, that pileated woodpecker is more beautiful than a house sparrow. Does that mean it's more important to protect pileated woodpeckers than house sparrows?
If your grounds are aesthetic value, yeah, it would follow. But that's not the only ground. I mean, in that case, I mean, they're an endangered species, and so the house sparrows are a dime a dozen, so we'd have to sort of, reverse it or something like that. Okay, sure. Let's.
We're seeing all this from the human point of view, and And it's like, we're so used to humans being at the center and seeing things in relation to ourselves. But when you talk about disinterestedness, I think that's maybe the highest value. I wonder if it is, because nature is, and so if we don't see it in terms of how we see it and its value for us, but its intrinsic value, there must be lots of things in nature that we don't know. We don't know about, but that play a vital part in the ecology. And so it seems to me that it's important to put maybe the highest value on disinterestedness.
If you mean intrinsic value, valuing nature for its own sake and not for what it can do for us, I'm in that camp. I believe that.
That's just, I mean, totally, that seems like it totally flies in the face of what you're saying about being invested in taking the person out into the desert. And to teach them.
But I'm not, I mean, that's a great worry. I'm not taking him out there to just try to discover oil in the ground or to get some new drug from the cactus so that I can cure cancer or something like that. I'm taking them out there to teach them to appreciate the desert for its own sake. Just like you think this guy's a jerk, I say, come on over, let's go out and have a beer with him, or let's go hiking with him, and you experience him and you learn to value him for his own sake. So
you're trying to change opinion by education in that sense, by taking them out, and look at changing persons' perceptions by educating them.
Sure. Yeah, that's the best way. The gentleman way up there and then the woman in front of him afterwards, but yeah. Now, you first. Yeah.
It seems to me that environmental aesthetics is too broad, and it gets muddied for me in a lot of people's interpretation. And a lot of the stuff I've read refers to ecological aesthetics. And your example of the house sparrow versus the pileated woodpecker, or the forester who sees beauty in the clear cut, I think it boils down to the whole issue of education as a tool in protecting the environment through aesthetics. And if you educate people on ecological process, and it brings with it the wonder and the beauty and the sublime and all those issues of aesthetics that are part of that ecological process, then you've educated people to see, I guess, aesthetics differently. That you look at the forest, like I do after having worked in the woods for so many years fighting fire, I can look at a forest and not find it to be as pretty as a forest that is burned more recently, because I understand that it's not a healthy forest, and my understanding of the ecological process of fire and the disturbance regimes changes my perception of what beauty is. And I think that's when you brought up the example of the pileated woodpecker and the house sparrow. The house sparrow is introduced. It's displaced a lot of native birds. There's no comparison in my mind, just because I have some marginal level of understanding of that, the impact on the ecosystem. Just environmental aesthetics itself, as an umbrella, is fine, but I think you can't really educate people on environmental ethics or aesthetics unless you break it down and change people's understanding on a sublime level. So when they see a pretty hillside in Missoula in the fall that's red, they understand it's red because it's leafy spurge, and it's not healthy. It's not healthy. But then, I don't know, I could go on and on.
Yeah, no, I think that's all very helpful. I think I agree with almost all of it. An example recently for me was, I've been noticing the forests around Bozeman looking a little brown, and kind of getting upset, and then I read in the paper that, well, my science right here, but it was spruce budworms, which, according to the paper, are kind of native, and they don't really kill the tree, and the forest will come back in 10 or 15 years, and they're different from, I think it was pine beetles, which actually kill the tree. And that then, I thought, well, maybe this isn't such so bad aesthetically, or because I sort of imagine we're not going to have a bunch of dead trees down the road. We're going to have, so, I mean, but that's just the kind of cognitive approach to aesthetics that I think is very important, very powerful, and has a lot in it. And, let me get the woman there, and then I'll take you here. Yes.
I was just going to say that I think that maybe one of the pieces that might be helpful among a lot of the questions was just the relationship between identity and interest.
Identity and interest?
Yes. So if I identify, if part of being a good mother is having a nice, lush green lawn for my child to play on, or part of being masculine is making sure no dandelions crop up, you know, in the midst of my perfect green lawn, which there's literature kind of addressing both perspectives, then it's about my identity. It's about how I identify. So if someone can package the aesthetic of the message comes to me in a way that I, as an audience member, am convinced that it's in my interest to kind of tweak my identity a bit. Oh, being a good mother means keeping, you know, toxins away from my child. Oh, you know, whatever. Being a man means the same thing. Whatever. That's just one example. But in some cases, aesthetic arguments might be very helpful, and in some cases they may not. It seems like it really depends on who you're talking to.
I like very much the notion that if you can tie something up with your identity, it becomes very powerful for motivating and moving people. But I would have wanted you to suggest that aesthetics might really help with that. But then you kind of said the opposite. You said that, that aesthetics, yeah, sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it isn't. I'm willing
It depends on the aesthetic, right? I mean, it could be like if your aesthetic is modern, if your aesthetic is country kitchen, if your aesthetic is natural, you know, it just, you know, if you're getting some sort of like hyper modern, if you're getting Dwell magazine versus getting Redbook magazine, for instance, if you're looking at those two different people, and you're going to talk to each, you know, potential, you know, green-leaning person about a behavior or a point of view, the aesthetic of the message is going to be very different. And I would argue that the way the message is conveyed is probably the most important aspect.
You should appeal to people's given aesthetics if you want to get them to do what you want, rather than educate their aesthetic so that it's better by your lights. This gentleman here. Yeah.
Monty Dolak pulls our leg all the time. He had a picture of the gates of the mountain with Bison looking over it as if the scene was Lewis and Clark, but then he had jet contrails going over the sky. I have albums of pictures that I could make a lot of money from because they're so damn beautiful. But when I edit them, I crop out all the human crap. And people say, can you take me to that scene? I said, sure, but you'll see all I-90 and the antennas and all the other crap. And I've just framed it, and that's the beauty I have in my album. I handle this my own way. We all do. And we all do. And you get these park magazines where you get a photojournalist going to some isolated lake in Glacier Park, and they'll write and they'll say, you got to be here. The next year, 6,000 people go to that spot and ruin the damn place. Yeah. So I think the aesthetics, I never tell anybody, no one, where I get my aesthetic highs. They can find their own damn aesthetic highs. Now, the last thing I'll say is, the other night, Red River was on, and you saw John Wayne looking at that gigantic sea of cattle, and he was telling the young man, isn't that the most beautiful sight you've ever seen? Cattle from you know, from foreground to background. So there's John Wayne. Well, that should be in your next version, I think. There's no question there.
That's perception again.
I think those are great comments. I think we're at 9. Do you want to take more? Or?
I'm happy. I don't know, people probably want to go home.
Yeah.
But let's have the gentleman up there. Maybe we'll have one last question.
Do you think scale and scope matter? Because it seems like seeing a picture of a coal stack today could be uglier than ever before because we recognize the interconnectedness of all things. And we know that there's a strong possibility the planet and species going extinct and climate change, that we're almost at a point where we're either doing things to help and heal the planet, or we're doing things that are just degrading it to a point that a lot of people are strongly concerned. So there's a justice, there's another thing that maybe that's what Luke was saying, that we know that it's a spirit. It goes beyond the disinterestedness, or I don't know. Do you think there's a scale and a scope to things that we've gone into, or there's always that?
I do think that the context of things makes a huge difference. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but if there were only 1 million humans, we could all drive Hummers happily. Is that sort of what you're? But given that we have the problems we have and that we're impacting the planet the way we are, then a smokestack really is a sign of problems, and which it might not have been when it was originally produced. It was a sign of progress, and maybe it really was progress, and it helped people live less badly. And so, yeah, I think context is really important here.
Well, I think Ned's very rich and interesting presentation generated a very rich and interesting discussion. And if you'd like to come down and talk to him, I'm sure he'd stick around and enjoy it. And I think we can continue the conversation tomorrow with Eureka. And I hope you'll come on out. And thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thanks to